For as long as I can remember, I've been the odd one out in my family of black sheep branded not by rebellion but by restraint. While they lived large, indulging in luxury cars, designer clothes, and European vacations, I drove a 10-year-old sedan that groaned on cold mornings, lived in a modest apartment smaller than their walk-in closets, and found joy in simple pleasures like hiking or sipping a decent cup of coffee. To them, my choices weren't just different, they were laughable. The mockery started subtly. Raised eyebrows when I parked my rest bucket at family gatherings, snickers about my sensible shoes, and endless jabs about how I was too pale because I skipped their $300 organic kale salads. But it wasn't just teasing, it was manipulation. Once, during a holiday dinner, my parents guilt-tripped me into buying VIP concert tickets for everyone. The cost? Nearly 2 months' worth of my carefully planned budget. As I watched them cheer over champagne backstage, I felt hollow, like an outsider funding their fantasy life while sacrificing pieces of my own. At every turn, I was made to feel inferior, like my frugality was a flaw rather than a virtue. When my dad called my car a classic, winking at uncles who roared with laughter, I smiled politely, though inside, it stung. My world collided with theirs in ways that left me isolated, judged, and silently resentful. Yet, I endured, burying my pride beneath layers of obligation and fear. Little did they know, the quiet man in the corner would soon rewrite the rules of this twisted game. Every family gathering felt like a performance, and I was the unwilling star of their ridicule show. My car, that trusty 10-year-old sedan, became their favorite punchline. "Oh, look who's arrived in the rolling tin can," my dad would bellow, winking at uncles who roared with laughter. My sister chimed in once, "Careful, Dad, don't lean on it too hard, you might just dent your Rolex." They even started a betting pool. How long before my antique finally broke down? It wasn't playful teasing, it was calculated humiliation. But the car wasn't the only target. One day, my sister posted a photo of my modest apartment online, captioning it, "Behold, the palace of the world's richest man." The comments flooded in, friends joked about its size, questioning whether it doubled as a closet. When I saw the post, I felt my chest tighten. She hadn't asked permission, it wasn't just mockery. It was exposure, a public declaration that I didn't measure up. Then there were the probing questions, always laced with judgment. At dinner parties, my mom would turn to her friends and ask, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Are you sure you're okay, honey? We worrying about you. Are you eating enough vegetables? You look pale." Pale not because I was sick, but because I skipped their $300 organic kale salads. Her tone dripped with faux concern, but her words carried weight. "You're failing." The worst moment came during one particularly lavish dinner. I declined to join them for an overpriced meal, citing budget constraints. My mother turned to her friends, feigning innocence. "He says he's fine," she said, shaking her head slightly, "but we just don't know." The room fell silent. Their stares burned into me, and I could feel my face flush. Was this really about concern or control? Each jab, each question, each shared glance chipped away at my self-worth. I tried to laugh it off, to remind myself they didn't mean harm. But deep down, their words stung like needles, piercing my pride. Every joke about my car, every snide comment about my apartment, every loaded question about my salary, it all screamed one thing: you're not good enough. And yet, despite their mockery, I kept showing up, kept smiling through gritted teeth. Because beneath the jokes lay something more insidious: guilt. Guilt that if I stopped playing along, I'd be further ostracized, labeled ungrateful or selfish. So I endured, burying my resentment under layers of forced politeness. The irony was almost too much to bear. My family mocked my frugal lifestyle while quietly siphoning off chunks of my income to sustain their extravagant habits. It wasn't just dependency, it was entitlement, masked under the guise of familial obligation. The requests started innocently enough: a loan here, a little help there. But over time, these temporary loans morphed into something darker, a sense that I owed them this money, that it was my duty to keep their champagne wishes afloat. One night stands out vividly in my memory. My phone buzzed at 2 a.m., jolting me awake. It was my dad, his voice urgent and panicked. "Son, we need your help right now. There's an emergency medical bill, $10,000. Can you transfer it immediately?" His tone left no room for hesitation. Still half asleep, I logged into my banking app and sent the funds, heart pounding with worrying for their well-being. 2 weeks later, I visited their house unannounced. As I walked through the door, I froze. Mounted on their living room wall was a brand new curved screen TV, the latest model, sleek and gleaming like some futuristic artifact. "What's this?" I asked, my voice tight. My mom breezed past me, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "Oh, your dad insisted. Isn't it gorgeous? Perfect for game nights." She smiled brightly, as if oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. That $10,000 emergency hadn't gone toward healthcare, it had funded entertainment. And then there were the complaints. No matter how much I gave, it was never enough. "You know, honey," my mom once said during one of her faux concern monologues, "if you could just contribute a little more regularly, maybe things wouldn't feel so tight around here." Tight? They vacationed in Europe annually, drove luxury SUVs, and hosted parties where caviar was served. Yet somehow, my contributions were deemed insufficient. Each transaction chipped away at my self-respect. I felt like their personal ATM, dispensing cash whenever they pleased. Worse still, I couldn't confront them, not without risking further ridicule or alienation. If I refused, I'd be labeled selfish, stingy, or worse, someone who didn't care about family. So I stayed silent, swallowing my resentment and watching as my hard-earned savings slipped away to fund their indulgences. But deep down, the realization gnawed at me. I wasn't helping them, I was enabling them. Every dollar I handed over reinforced their belief that I existed to subsidize their lifestyle. And yet, breaking free felt impossible. Guilt weighed heavily on me, compounded by years of emotional manipulation. How do you say no to the people who raised you, even when they treat your generosity as a birthright? My 30th birthday arrived like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken truths and years of pent-up resentment. That night, I sat alone in my modest apartment, the glow of my laptop illuminating the small space as I stared at my latest investment statement. The numbers told a story. Years of disciplined saving, strategic investing, and careful planning had paid off. My portfolio wasn't just growing, it was thriving. Yet here I was, still being mocked for driving a decade-old sedan while quietly funding their extravagant lifestyle. The absurdity hit me like a freight train. They laughed at my frugality, called me a failure behind closed doors, yet eagerly accepted every dollar I handed over. I thought about all the times they'd made fun of my choices, the snickers when I pulled up in my rust bucket, the condescending questions about whether I was really okay. And then there was that moment, the one that cut deepest, my sister calling me cheap in front of her friends, her voice dripping with disdain. She hadn't even tried to soften the blow. I remembered how I'd smiled politely through gritted teeth, pretending it didn't hurt, but inside, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. But tonight, something snapped. It wasn't just anger, it was clarity. I realized I'd let myself become their personal ATM, doling out cash to sustain their champagne wishes while sacrificing pieces of my own dignity. Every loan, every transfer, every forced contribution had chipped away at my self-worth until I barely recognized myself anymore. I wasn't living for me, I was living for them, trapped in a cycle of guilt and obligation. I opened a new email draft and stared at the blank screen. For years, I'd avoided confrontation, fearing their judgment, their lectures, their emotional manipulation. But now, sitting here surrounded by the evidence of my financial success, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before finally typing. "Hi Mom and Dad, effective next month, I will no longer be able to provide financial assistance. Love." I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Then I clicked send. It was midnight, the clock ticking into my 30th year, marking not just another birthday but the beginning of something new, a life where I stopped apologizing for who I was and started demanding respect. As I closed my laptop, nausea churned in my stomach. What would they say? How would they react? Part of me expected an immediate explosion, an angry phone call, a barrage of texts, but none came. Instead, silence stretched across the digital void, thick and suffocating. For the first time in years, I felt truly free and terrified. Free because I'd finally taken control, and terrified because I knew this decision would change everything. The email was sent at midnight, the precise moment when I knew no one would pick up the phone to confront me immediately. It was a calculated move, born of both strategy and cowardice. I needed time to process my own decision, time to brace for their reaction, and most importantly, time to ensure I wouldn't crumble under the weight of their emotional manipulation. The message itself was simple, direct, and devoid of drama. Effective next month, I will no longer be able to provide financial assistance. By morning, the silence had become suffocating. I sat at my desk staring at my phone, half expecting it to explode with calls or texts, When it finally rang, I felt my stomach drop. It was my mom. Her voice trembled as she spoke, each word laced with accusation and pain. How could you do this to us? Do you want to kill me? Is this how you repay everything we've done for you? Her tone shifted between anger and despair, as though I'd committed an unforgivable betrayal. She didn't yell, not outright, but her quiet devastation cut deeper than any scream ever could. Then came the silence. For an entire week, they said nothing. No follow-up calls, no emails, no messages. Just emptiness. It was maddening. Every unanswered text I sent, every ignored attempt at conversation, felt like a brick being added to the wall between us. My mind raced with doubts. Had I gone too far? Was I wrong to draw this line? What if they never forgave me? What if they cut me out completely? But beneath the fear, something else simmered, a stubborn resolve. I reminded myself why I'd made the decision in the first place. Years of mockery, exploitation, guilt trips, and subtle belittlement. They had treated me like their personal ATM, laughing at my choices while quietly draining my resources. And now, faced with the prospect of losing that safety net, they were silent, not because they understood, but because they were strategizing. I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into work, going for long runs, anything to quiet the storm inside, but the uncertainty lingered, gnawing at me. Would they disown me? Would I lose my family over this? The thought terrified me, yet I refused to back down. If standing my ground meant risking their approval, then so be it. I couldn't keep living a life where my generosity was taken for granted and my dignity was sacrificed on the altar of familial obligation. The air in the living room was suffocating, thick with unspoken accusations and barely concealed resentment. We were all seated around the large mahogany table, my parents at the head, my sister next to her husband, aunts, uncles, cousins filling in the gaps. Every eye was on me, their gazes sharp and judgmental, as if I were some criminal awaiting sentencing. The forced smiles from earlier had vanished, replaced by cold stares that weighed heavily on my chest. My dad cleared his throat, a sound so loud it felt like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. He stood up, his face flushed with anger, his voice booming across the room. Is this what we raised you to be? A selfish man who turns his back on family? His words hit me like a dagger straight to the heart. For years, I'd endured their mockery, their subtle jabs about my modest lifestyle. But this accusation of selfishness was unbearable. It wasn't just unfair, it was a complete distortion of reality. Before I could respond, my sister burst into tears, her sobs echoing through the tense silence. How could you do this to us? She cried, her voice trembling with emotion. You're ruining everything. You're destroying our family. Her words cut deeper than I expected, not because they were true, but because of the hypocrisy behind them. She, of all people, had mocked me the most, calling me cheap in front of her friends, laughing at my old car, dismissing my choices as failures. And now, here she was, accusing me of betrayal. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to steady myself. Years of pent-up frustration bubbled to the surface, threatening to spill over. I couldn't stay silent any longer. Do you really want to talk about selfishness? I shot back, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. For years, you've laughed at my choices, you've called me a failure because I didn't live like you. But guess what? All those times you mocked my modest lifestyle, you were perfectly happy to take my money. My hard-earned money. The room fell silent, save for my sister's occasional sniffles. My mom leaned forward, her lips pressed into a thin line. We never asked for anything, she said, her tone defensive, almost wounded. No, you didn't ask, I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm. But you took, over and over again. A new car here, a home repaired there, vacations, medical bills that never ended. And now, when I finally say no, suddenly I'm the bad guy. My Aunt Carol gasped audibly, while Cousin Tim shifted uncomfortably in his seat. My dad's face turned an even darker shade of red. That's enough, he barked, slamming his hand on the table. You think you're better than us. Is that it? No, I said firmly, leaning forward to meet his gaze. I don't think I'm better than anyone, but I do think it's time you stop treating me like your personal ATM. You can't have it both ways. You can't laugh at me for being frugal while quietly draining my bank account. That's not family, that's exploitation. The tension in the room was palpable, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Then, without warning, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a stack of neatly printed documents, copies of my most recent bank statements. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly but my resolve unwavering. Here, I said, handing them out one by one. so you know exactly what kind of failure your son really is. As each family member scanned the numbers, their expressions shifted from shock to disbelief to something resembling awe. Aunt Carol's mouth hung open, forming a perfect O. Cousin Tim dropped his beer can with a clang. My sister's scowl softened into wide-eyed astonishment. My parents, sitting at the head of the table, stared at their copies in stunned silence. The atmosphere changed instantly. The anger dissipated, replaced by a strange mix of reverence and embarrassment. My dad's face paled, his earlier fury melting into awkward discomfort. My mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her mascara smudged. For the first time in years, I saw them for what they truly were, not judges, but dependents. The moment I handed out the bank statements, the room transformed into a theater of shock and disbelief. Aunt Carol adjusted her reading glasses, her mouth slowly forming a perfect O as she scanned the numbers. Cousin Tim dropped his beer can with a clang, muttering something under his breath about crypto stocks. My dad, who had been sitting stiffly in his chair, suddenly stood up, his face flushing crimson, not from anger this time, but from sheer embarrassment. Uncle Greg, who had always dismissed me as the cheap one, leaned back in his seat, shaking his head in stunned silence. I can't believe it, he whispered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. This kid's richer than all of us combined. His tone was a mix of awe and self-deprecation, as if realizing for the first time how wrong he'd been about me. But the real showstopper was my mom. Just moments ago, she'd been crying, tears streaming down her face in what I assumed was guilt or frustration. Now, those same tears seemed to evaporate as she wiped her mascara-streaked cheeks and turned to me with a newfound sweetness. "Oh, honey," she cooed, her voice dripping with admiration. "You're so smart. I always knew you'd make it big." Her words hung in the air, heavy with irony. Always knew. If only she'd shown half this enthusiasm when I was quietly funding their extravagant lifestyle. Then came my dad, awkwardly clearing his throat yet again. "You know, son," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "maybe we should take a look at that old car of yours. Make sure it's running okay." He even gestured toward the garage as if ready to roll up his sleeves and inspect the engine himself. The same car he'd mocked as a rolling tin can just hours earlier was now being treated like a vintage treasure. The shift in their attitudes was almost comical. One minute, they were accusing me of selfishness. The next, they were practically fawning over me. My sister, who had called me cheap in front of her friends, suddenly leaned in with genuine curiosity. "So, what's your secret?" she asked, her eyes gleaming with a mix of admiration and thinly veiled envy. As I watched them scramble to adjust their perceptions of me, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. Their hypocrisy was laid bare, exposed by the very numbers they'd once ridiculed. For years, they'd judged my frugality, laughed at my choices, and quietly taken my money. Now, faced with undeniable proof of my success, they were tripping over themselves to praise me. It was surreal and deeply satisfying. As the evening dragged on, their newfound admiration became unbearable. My parents, once dismissive of my choices, now peppered me with questions about investment strategies and savings plans. "Maybe you could mentor us," my mom suggested sweetly, as if the past years of mockery had never happened. I declined, my tone firm but polite. Their sudden interest wasn't genuine, it was transactional, another attempt to benefit from my success. I left early, unable to stomach another moment of their thinly veiled attempts at reconciliation. Driving home in the quiet darkness, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. Relief because I had finally broken free from their judgment and control. Emptiness because the relationships I once cherished now felt irreparably fractured. For years, I had craved their approval, their acceptance, but now, I realized it didn't matter. What mattered was the freedom I'd reclaimed. The ability to live life on my own terms, without guilt or obligation. But as I gripped the steering wheel, a sobering truth settled over me. I would never fully trust them again. Their hypocrisy had shattered something fundamental. Yet, strangely, this realization didn't sadden me. Trust wasn't essential, not when I had proven to myself that I could stand alone. The nightmare of their ridicule and manipulation was over, and though scars remained, I emerged stronger, wiser, and unshackled. In the end, I realized that being sensible and practical wasn't just a lifestyle choice, it was my superpower. It wasn't about deprivation or missing out. It was about discipline, foresight, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're building something real. My family had mocked me for years, but their ridicule only strengthened my resolve. The same choices they laughed at, the modest car, The frugal vacations, the refusal to overspend were the very things that secured my freedom. I've come to embrace my role as the black sheep of the family. If anything, I wear it like a badge of honor. While they chased fleeting luxuries, I built lasting wealth. While they sought validation through material possessions, I found peace in financial independence. And when they finally saw my bank statements, their stunned silence spoke louder than any apology ever could. Now, when my mom compliments my sensible car or my sister asks for investment advice, I smile not because I feel vindicated, but because I know I've earned their respect on my own terms. They may never fully understand me, and that's okay. What matters is that I understand myself. Sensible and practical isn't just how I live, it's who I am. And it's exactly what got me to where I am today.